Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's exclusive briefing. What's next for Iran? Shifting power, regional risk, and global implications. I'm Matt Burke from LifeWrap, and we're thrilled to have you join with us today for this closed door discussion. The conflict in and around Iran has created a rapidly changing landscape, one with major implications for global stability, economic security, and risk management. To help us unpack what's really happening on the ground and what may come next, we're honored to be joined by three distinguished experts with decades of leadership experience in diplomacy, intelligence, and national security. Joining our panel today, we have Ambassador Alina Romanowski, recently retired after more than 40 years of U.S. government service. She served as the U.S. ambassador to both Iraq and Kuwait. Ted Singer. He served 35 years at the Central Intelligence Agency, where he was the head of Middle East operations and five-time chief of station, as well as Mark Friedman, the principal and CEO of Rebel Global Security. Prior to founding Rebel, Mark served nearly a decade with the U.S. State Department as chief of staff to the ambassador at large for counterterrorism. Together, this panel brings more than a century of combined experience helping governments and global organizations navigate conflict, intelligence, and geopolitical risk. Ambassador Romanowski, Ted Singer, Mark Friedman, we're honored to have you today, and nice to see you all.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here.
Good to be here.
Awesome. And to jump right into questions, there's a lot of noise right now conflicting reporting. To ground our audience here, briefly, how did we arrive to this particular instance?
Well, Matt, I think we got to know how we got here in order to figure out how we're going to exit from here. And I'm not going to go over Persia's long ancient history. I'm just going to take you back to right before New Year's, which I think is sort of a good date to start to unpack where we are now. So Prime Minister Netanyahu invited himself to Mar-a-Lago to meet with President Trump and effectively table dropped hot intelligence on to President Trump to the effect that after the 12-day war last June, Iran was reconstituting its ballistic missiles, including the launchers that are able to shoot these things at Israel. Second of all, that Iran was reconstituting its nuclear program. And third of all, that Iran was reconstituting some of its sort of rat lines to resupply Hezbollah and Lebanon. These are sort of the three pillars of the Iranian octopus, as the Israelis call it. And he left there trying to get a deal from President Trump to engage in a joint war. The Israelis, for at least 5 administrations, have been trying to sort of push for a joint war to decapitate the octopus, as they would say. And I don't think he left with a deal in his pocket. But about 2 weeks later, these protests in Iran started erupting. And just briefly on these protests and Iran, this is a country of 90 million people. It's not ethnically homogeneous. There are minorities. Big ones include Azeris, Kurds, and Baluch. And each of these ethnic groups has populations in neighboring countries. All of those different ethnic groups participated in some way, shape, or form in these protests. In addition, the middle class, sort of the college kids that we've seen in previous protests, they too came out in mass, as to be expected. They've been usually the front lines of all previous protests. But the two sort of classes of Iranians that joined these protests were a little bit remarkable. First of all, the capital class, the Bazaris. These are the people who run business in Iran. They too were out in these protests. And the most remarkable one were folks in the rural countryside. This is the basis of the Ayatollah's. It's his base, his political base, his spiritual base, his supporters. Because of the dire economic situation and frankly mismanagement of water resources, these folks out in the boondocks were now joining protests against the regime. It was in that sort of moment that I think in President Trump's mind, things sort of crystallized. You had this intelligence that Iran was was rebuilding some of its threats to Israel. Second of all, you heard President Trump come out and say he wanted to protect the protesters. And then third of all, there's a window of opportunity that was still open from last year's 12-day war, which were ginormous holes in Iran's air defenses. The Israelis during that brief conflict were able to basically have air superiority uh, and air corridors to move with, frankly, with impunity from Israel into Iran. So those ingredients combined were basically what led to this first time a joint war between the United States and Iran, or between the United States and Israel against Iran. We've heard, and just getting closer to where we are today, we've all heard the varying and differing at sometimes sort of objectives of this war. Uh, Let's just take the pure basic military objectives of this war as defined by the commander of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the commander of CENTCOM. It is to eliminate Iran's ability to project power outside its borders, one. Two, to protect U.S. forces. Pretty clear objectives for a military operation. These then get clouded by a couple of things. One are probably messages out of Washington that it alternately speak to protecting protesters, regime change, no nuclear, no ballistic, no proxies. This gets a little bit clouded, but I think for the purposes of where we are right now, we should just keep focused on those two specific military objectives because achieving those is what will allow this conflict to end, whether it's with a political settlement or with an invasion or everything in between. But those two military objectives are what it is. So where we are now, the war starts. The Israelis assassinate the supreme leader, and they have been slowly but surely going down the ranks of Iran's leadership in the political, military, and security services. So we're now probably at about tier 3 of most of those individuals. This ha- did not have the intended effect uh, that the Israelis were certainly looking for, which was to discombobulate Iran's ability for command and control. The Iranians moved very quickly to a system called mosaic defense, by which they took 30 separate regional commands across the country and basically said, you shall execute this war to defend Iran. So these 30 different command and control nodes, for the most part, had the ability to pick targets against which to shoot at the outset of this war. Most of the materiel was focused on Israel. Iran quickly realized they had to regionalize this crisis. And by regionalizing, what I mean is bringing in the Gulf countries. Iran was well stocked with interceptors to protect Iran or protect Israel. The United States Navy was well protected. U.S. bases were well protected. But the soft underbelly that Iran saw, and this is sort of something I think analysts had well predicted long ago, if there was a war, the soft underbelly to regionalize this conflict were the GCC countries. This was an effort by Iran to basically get the Gulf countries, who have major, obviously, oil desalination projects that they want to move on to Vision 2030 and live in the future. Iran calculated that by bringing them into this conflict, they would apply economic, if not military pressure on the United States to draw this fight to a fairly rapid end and leave the regime in place. Fighting continued, and basically what Iran then did was also right out of the playbook, which was to shut the Hormuz Straits and now globalize this conflict so that you're now having markets, other foreign leaders calling Washington and saying, what the hell? So that's where we are right now. Iran has this asymmetric capability to continue to regionalize this, is having an asymmetric ability on the global economy. In other words, to globalize this. And I think what we heard this morning from President Trump to stand down on attacks on Iran's electric infrastructure is probably a calculated pause to take a look at where things are. Markets reacted well. Second of all, he's called for about 5,000 U.S. Marines to come from the Far East and from the West Coast of the United States. Those Marines could be a threat, could be a real operation, but ultimately they would be the force that I think President Trump would have to use with some additional ships to unblock the Hormuz. They're still about 2 weeks out. So whether this call for a pause was to give those Marines time to arrive, whether it was Gulf countries saying, let's get this over, because as you saw on the 18th of March, Iran and the Gulfies, or Iran attacked critical Gulf infrastructure, refineries. Bahrain took some really hard hits on its oil industry, its desalinization industry. So this kind of mutually assured destruction thing, my guess is President Trump heard some complaints from Gulfies that this is now starting to cut into bone. It's no longer just fat. So that's where we are. He's got to make this decision. Whether these back channel communications are real, don't know. The White House sort of is vague. The Iranians have denied it, but channels have been open throughout this entire conflict. There is a mechanism in Switzerland for contact. The Omanis, who are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, have been a long time sort of interlocutor to try and bring some resolution to crises when they do arise in the Persian Gulf. So I think that's about where we are.
Yeah, that was extremely insightful, Ted. And Alina or Mark, do you have anything else to expand upon that?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about kind of where as Ted was talking about where the Gulf leaders are as they look to this. I'll get into sort of the greatest risk for them a little bit later, but let me just expand a little bit on what Ted said. So, obviously, this is the Iranian reaction to this is really an Iranian reaction that's on steroids if you compare it to what they were doing in October 7th reaction, which was a lot. I mean, it was focused on Israel. They essentially, to a large extent, except in a few cases, had left the Gulfies and our presence there pretty much alone. But in this this time around, and it was predictable that both the Iran and the proxies in Iraq in particular have not really spared the Gulf states from any attacks. They've launched barrages of Iranian missiles and drones, and they've really essentially left the GCC leadership with an unenviable choice. Either they anger their closest ally and security guarantor, that's us, or risk the wrath of a powerful neighbor that they have to live beside long after the war ends. So they had to figure out what they were going to do. It was very clear in many of the both public and private conversations that are going on that they had no interest in getting into the war, but sort of how do they manage it? So right now, I would say that most of the regional leaders are really living as what we would call in the moment. They're really not looking into too far into the future. That most of them have taken a less of a regional kind of let's get together, even though they do have foreign ministers meetings and they're talking, but the leadership itself is really focused on their own countries and the damage that the Iranians or the Iranian Iraqi militias are inflicting on their populations. And really the last thing that they want to deal with are the protests or conflict that would erupt in their own communities, in their own countries. Each one of those countries the population could react differently, but the reality is they don't want to have to deal with that right now. Then in living the moment, they're also looking at having to deal with what do they need to do to protect themselves and to build their countries. Many of them are looking at how do they restructure their military capabilities that they have, or how can they grab some more in case because they postponed a lot of acquisitions, a lot of collaboration, a lot of cooperation, and they're really looking at how they're doing it. They're also looking a little bit again at how do they as Ted said, mute some of that economic impact that it's having. Let me just say a little bit on the energy production. Some of the Gulf countries that are real big producers are producing really at maximum capacity to try to keep these prices down, even though the attacks have taken a lot of their energy facilities offline, both oil and LNG, or liquid, gas. But calibrating and managing the production and how they're doing this is increasingly difficult to manage, especially as the straits are closed to everyone but Iranian shipping. But in particular, I mean, everybody's is having an impact on their budgets, but it's particularly, I think, acute for the Iraqis. The war is having a big impact on their budget, and also their own government formation. Those who are still consider themselves in the Abraham Accords, which is largely UAE, but some others, and are working quietly with the Israelis to support their security interests, working with us more closely, and also trying to get others to send them stuff, specifically air defense kinds of stuff. Let me take a moment now to talk a little bit about the Iran-backed Iraqi militias. We were very successful last time around to get the militias to essentially stand down and stay out of the war, both in discussions that we were having with the Iraqi government, but also in our own reaction and our messaging to the militias. This time around, they're much more active, and they're much more active in some ways because they have decided that they're going to make sure that the axis of resistance takes a position. So that's complicated things in Iraq for sure. And also those militias are attacking some of the neighbors, which complicates it even more for the Iraqi government, which first of all is in a caretaker status, and second of all, either is unwilling or unable to really double down and get those, what we often call rogue militias, to fall in line and not do stuff. Speaking of pauses that Ted mentioned, in addition to our own, interestingly enough, the Iranian-backed Iraqi militias also are taking a 5-day pause and agreeing not to attack targets in Iraq or outside. I think that's largely because for them and some of their leadership, they've been hit pretty hard inside Iraq. And also, I think they are in probably negotiations with the government to pull back so they don't drive the Iraqis in having to get involved in the war. So stay tuned for that, because whether or not they adhere to that, which I don't predict that they will, at some point they'll resume their attacks, but how they do it and where they do it is going to be a big, I think, indicator of where the negotiations with the Iraqi government, currently the caretaker, have landed with respect to not dragging Iraq into the war. Also, and I invite both Ted and Mark to comment on this, but I was reading with respect to the Straits of Hormuz that are closed. Obviously, there's a big push by President Trump to try to build a coalition that can try to open it. But at the same time, I read reports that the Iranians have announced that they're going to allow some countries to use the straits. And of course, those who can I'll just tick them off quickly: China, India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Iraq, Turkey, Japan, Greece to some extent, and the big fat no's that can't use it are going to be the US, Israel, UK, France, Germany, UAE, Saudi Arabia. And that has an impact both on sort of oil, LNG, but we're now seeing the Gulf very concerned about their food security, because the reality is they import most of their food. and a lot of it and products, and a lot of it comes through the Gulf. So that's going to be another challenge as we navigate sort of the next step, and whether or not, in fact, the Iranians can actually allow the the shippings that they want to go through and not the other ones. So that's another area where you could see some serious escalation. But I'm going to leave it at that. See if anybody else wants to add to that. But it is very clear that the Gulf leaders, and I'll get into that a little bit later on some of the questions that were posed. But honestly, they are. They are definitely on the side with us. They don't want to see an Iran with nuclear capability or with rockets and more drones, etc. But they also are, very cautious about how they're going to be responding. Over.
Yeah, and thank you for expanding upon that. I did want to go back to you for a moment, Ted. We were just curious, who effectively is in charge today, and how should we understand the current balance between political, military, and security actors inside of the Iranian system?
So you really,
Ted.
have a sort of four-legged stool currently in charge, and some of them are more in charge than others, and discerning sort of who is the actual decision maker is very complicated. And I'm not trying to weasel out of answering the question, because I'm about to say who the four are, and I'll give you my best guess. So Ayatollah Khamenei, who was assassinated on the opening night of this conflict, his son, a guy named Mojtaba, who's actually a heinous, corrupt guy, right? And there's a point to this, is named, not elected. They weren't able to herd the 80, 90, and 100-year-old mullahs to have an election. So he was appointed by the previous head of the National Security Council, a guy named Larijani. So he's symbolic. He's got the name, and he's also an irritant to President Trump. And they put him in charge. My guess is hoping he would probably no longer be on this planet very long. He was badly damaged in the opening nights of this conflict. By my understanding, he's missing a leg and his face is disfigured, which is one of the reasons maybe we haven't seen him. So we don't really know how mentis compos he is, and whether he is actually issuing these various statements that come out. But from sort of a psychological operations perspective, the fact that he's doing it means that the sort of merging of religion and state that rules Iran is still intact. And he's also sort of a thorn in the side of President Trump. So he's there. The degree to which he makes decisions, very hard to detect or to discover now that I'm out here in the civilian wilderness. Second, you have President Pezeshkian. Nice guy. Nice guys usually finish last. He was not a particular force when the regime was up and running, sort of second fiddle to the rest of the players. But he is sort of a progressive, so to speak. He's a doctor by trade. And he's still, by the grace of Israeli and U.S. aircraft, still walking on this planet, and probably walking on this planet for a reason. Third is the Speaker of Parliament. This his name is Ghalibaf. Clever guy, wheeler dealer, sort of take away your worst caricature of Iran of sort of being run by mullahs. This guy is sort of a backroom political dealer type. He's well connected. He's not a complete radical, sort of fundamentalist, but he is in with the regime. And again, he too is walking on the planet Earth by the grace of military decisions by the United States, but more importantly, Israel. So those are sort of the three kind of political figures. where it gets murkier, and we're now down to sort of the third rank of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leadership. It's headed by a guy named Vahidi, who is a through and through IRGC guy, was in the Quds force. He's a warrior. He's clever. But remember, he comes from fairly low, as the Israelis in the United States have sort of eliminated IRGC leadership. He, as I tried to sort of mention earlier, the way they're running this military operation is these field commanders have a fair amount of autonomy. And I think, again, it's very hard to discern from the outside looking in, but the command and control structure of Iran has been badly damaged. And this Mosaic plan was created partly to prevent the loss of contact during, if there's a conflict, when the first thing that's hit is communications. So he's relying on these commanders to do a lot of their own sort of figure out where Iran is, and he might be able to get them some broad commands, but actual day-to-day command and control structure, I think, has been pretty severely beaten. So those are the sort of four legs of the stool. And if I were a betting man, my guess is it's Galibaf and Vahidi, who are probably the ones actually making decisions on whether, when, or how to have a back channel with the United States or find a way out of this. Those two, I think, are the ones in the driver's seat.
Yeah, that's extremely powerful information, Ted. And Mark, I wanted to zoom out for a moment and look at our audience's world, the global businesses, critical infrastructure, and domestic security. Curious, what are the near-term implications they should be paying attention to? And where do you see the most meaningful risk or pressure points emerging for Western governments and private sector orgs?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Well, I mean, as I think the audience can tell from what Ted and Alina have covered, it is just a rapidly moving and evolving situation. And so, I mean, we've been, to let your audience in, we've been thinking through this webinar, obviously, for a few days, a week maybe. And just this morning with the president's, tweet around, potential delay and additional attacks and the opportunity for negotiations, it just speaks to how quickly this is evolving. And so that's all to say that I think from a corporate perspective, it's not particularly useful to focus in on one particular element of the conflict or one particular event that occurs, because it's going to change within the next 12 to 24 hours. I would suggest for corporate audiences to think about everything that's going on in the context of at least kind of three tiers, which range from the most tangible and direct impact on your business to potentially the most abstract. So those are as follows. First of all, the most direct or tangible impacts are direct risk of physical or cyber attack on your company, whether that's via employees that you have in the Middle East or assets that are far from the Middle East but may be susceptible to Iranian or Iranian-sponsored cyber attacks. So physical attacks obviously come in the form of Iranian rocket strikes, drone strikes, missile strikes, particularly in the Gulf and in the Levant. And we've seen a lot of companies looking at duty of care obligations, travel risk management programs related to how do we take care of our employees who are in the region as this conflict unfolds. But the cyber attack on Stryker is obviously held up as kind of the preeminent example so far in this conflict of the reach of Iranian cyber capabilities. U.S. and Western companies, depending on the sector that they operate in, depending on what they might signify or symbolize in this conflict, are certainly kind of within the realm of targetability for the Iranians. So that would be kind of the first tier, to look at what exposures your company has to those direct attacks. The second tier would be risk related to energy and supply chain. Obviously, Strait of Hormuz is the crown jewel right now when we think about this, and to some extent, every company around the world, and you could even say every person around the world is going to feel the impacts in some way of impacts to oil markets, et cetera. But there are also, beyond Strait of Hormuz, very specific supply chain disruptions that are happening, especially with regard to airspace closures throughout the Middle East. So companies need to be looking at their supply chain posture, supply chain risk management programs, and whether they need to move to contingency plans, version 2, version 3, for how they're typically sourcing product or other things that are part of their supply chain, because we really don't know how long this disruption is going to continue. But I think so far, everything indicates that it will not wrap up in a nice, pretty bow, in the way that maybe the president had articulated on day one of the conflict within 3 to 4 weeks. I think we're in week 3 or week 4 right now. And then the third category is more abstract, and I think particularly for corporate security and intelligence teams, not in the typical wheelhouse, but something that they should be aware of. And I label this as essentially positioning risk. This conflict is creating major ripples and impacts across all sorts of markets. And some companies are going to really be at risk from that, and some companies may be able to benefit. And I think one specific example of this, Alina mentioned liquefied natural gas, LNG. So Qatar provides about 20% of global LNG. That obviously has to get shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. There are other countries around the world that are major LNG providers. And as that natural gas goes offline, it creates greater demand for liquefied natural gas coming from other countries, namely North America. The United States and Canada are major suppliers of natural gas. And so that's just an example that some companies may be able to seize commercial opportunities, even as they need to mitigate risks to their business. And so corporate intelligence teams that can provide insight on the details of what's going on in this conflict and what's likely to happen in the coming weeks, not just for the purpose of tiers 1 and 2, right? Protecting your people, protecting your information, managing your supply chains, but also to provide insight to business leaders within your company about how to navigate this from a business and commercial perspective. That's a really important value that intelligence teams could provide, and that they should have in the back of their minds as this conflict continues to unfold.
Yeah, thank you, Merrick. Alina, did you have something to add?
Well, I was gonna sort of go into a slightly deeper dive, if you're ready for that, on the probably what I would call the first 2 categories that Mark was talking about, and put it in a little context and just actually give companies and folks who are listening something, both reminders, but also a little bit of context on what they can do specifically. First of all, I would say that it could very well be that companies there and here are a little back-footed on kind of how to approach the security piece of this, because the reality is usually our embassies and the State Department provide warnings, or they begin to shift personnel. They announce that things are going not that there's a movement, and that decisions have been made to bring back diplomats and to encourage Americans to leave. This didn't happen this time around. It was very slow, except in Lebanon when the embassy went on authorized departure. But and the reality is, for the past, I would say 2-3 years, and in some countries much longer, the State Department's travel advisories have been pretty much at the highest levels. So the question is, we're still operating there. Businesses are still investing. Companies are going forward with opportunities, as Mark said. But at the same time, there's a do not travel in almost all the countries right now. And so that can be very, very confusing. But I do want to just sort of highlight that these travel advisories really are an opportunity for us for the State Department and the U.S. government to describe the risks and recommended precautions for U.S. citizens, not foreign nationals necessarily, in a foreign destination. And so when the State Department, the government, and our chiefs of mission have to deal with what is really their highest priority, which is the safety and security of U.S. citizens abroad, there are ways in which we can provide the kind of information both that can address some of the security challenges in the first tier, but also what's going on that's going to impact the energy and the supply chain and other security issues. So I'm really not going to get into a lot of the travel details of each of the categories or the risk advisories that these advisories cover, but encourage those of you who want a deeper dive on it to go on the State Department's travelstate.gov website. But I will say that these travel advisories are based on our assessments in categories of crime, terrorism, unrest, health, natural disaster, time-limited event, which this is what we are in right now, kidnapping, wrongful detention, and any of the other potential risks to the Americans. So when we come up with decisions with respect to advisories, but also evacuations, this is all calculated. This is all calculated based on the risk indicators and for each of these countries. Our evacuation orders are really based on an assessment for imminent threats to Americans in a country, and also a decision that the USG has made that warrants an evacuation of diplomats and American citizens. Whether they take it or not is up to them. We make sure that these are done publicly because the U.S. government has a policy of no double standard and follows a duty to warn all Americans. So it's not so everybody gets the same information and comments on the situation. So I would say there are a couple of really concrete things I'll go through very quickly. One is I encourage those who have not yet joined the Overseas Advisory Security Council, OSAC as we call it. It's a public-private partnership that's been around since 1985, set up by the State Department to promote the security cooperation between the U.S. private sector and the Department of State's Diplomatic Security Service. And what it fosters is this global network for timely exchanges of information and also best practices to mitigate the risks to interests in various countries. It now has over 30,000 members. And as a two-time ambassador in that region full of conflict and challenges, I can tell you that it's really a two-way street. It builds dialogue between the private sector and the government, but it also allows the private sector to help especially embassies that don't get out much and are in constant threat levels to better understand what's going on. So we get a much fuller picture in every country about what's going on with respect to the threats and the challenges that businesses are facing. For example, if businesses are hearing that airspace and airlines are going to change their scheduling, sometimes we're the last to know. We, meaning the U.S. government, State Department, the embassies are the last to know. I would also encourage you, and this is sort of telling you something you probably already know, but planning is really the key to success. Make your plans in your businesses to address possible changes in these travel advisories. If it's not already at a level 4, it could get there very quickly in this environment. And also think about if you have to evacuate your personnel. Establish, these up-to-date employee contact lists. Consider the contingencies we do all the time in the government about how do we move hundreds of thousands of Americans in the region if you don't have the assets. So please think about how you would do it with the people you have. Would they shelter in place? Would they? How are they going to respond? How are you going to, as a company, going to respond to that? There are phone trees, there are emergency meeting locations, et cetera. There's a lot of things, and actually, OSAC will help in supporting some of these practices. But really, make sure you know who to call if you want reliable information. There's a lot of disinformation right now out there about who's doing what has happened, where were attacked, where did the Iranians strike, where what happened to facilities, and you do often need to get that information. And honestly, having good contact information at the embassy's regional security office can really help. And then finally, a very sort of bureaucratic but very important step that was established by the State Department a couple of years ago, and that's the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program, often referred to as STEP. It's a free service, first of all, for Americans, whether they're traveling or living in a country, to receive email updates and alerts from the local embassy or consulate. So you have to register for it. And you can do it again if you go to the State Department's website. But this allows the embassy, if there are notifications to Americans in the country, to get to them right away. It also helps the embassy and the consulate to contact you or your embassy or your designated emergency contact, so that both you and your emergency contact, your families, your friend, whoever it is, can make informed decisions about your own safety if your facility is attacked, if the neighborhood's attacked, or if you have to start the evacuation. So I will say that the State Department, because this region has been in, and others as well, but this region has been under a lot of stress because of these conflicts, and Americans want information they want to do, and because when you need to move thousands of Americans quickly, these are the kinds of things that really help to get the information and allow your employees, Americans, to make the kinds of decisions that they need to do if they're under these kinds of threats. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop with that. But they're very concrete steps, and we really are encouraging people to do that because it makes a huge difference. My experience is in the countries where we had people, we could reach out to people consistently and use the OSAC network and the STEP. It was much easier to deal with the crisis and get information around. So I encourage everybody to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Alina. It's good to know those tools exist. I wanted to quickly, I know we're getting close to time here, but I want to quickly jump into a few audience questions. Ted, this one's going to be directed to you. We're hearing a lot about Iranian-linked protests and tensions emerging outside the region, including in Western countries. How should organizations interpret and prepare for these types of developments?
I guess I would say the Iranian diaspora is pretty much global, concentrated in Europe, North America, but there are pockets of them since the 1979 revolution everywhere. They're not homogeneous, and by that I mean there are different groups protesting for different reasons. And the protesters themselves, I wouldn't so much worry about. It's probably the lone wolf and all of the sort of nasty behavior that Iran does with its own diaspora abroad. So Iran has used AI, disinformation, misinformation, memes. You've seen them on the internet. You've seen the President of the United States scold media for even alluding to some of these products out there. But the protesters overseas among Iranian diaspora are not so much worrisome. They're probably good people concerned about what's going on in their country or the welfare of their family, etc. But what the Iranians have taken a chapter from sort of the Russian book of gray zone. And by gray zone, what I mean is they go online and try and recruit individuals or co-opt individuals, threaten to put them on Interpol red notices, and try and basically either pay them or induce them to undertake sort of small boorish operations. So some of the folks you saw arrested in the UK not too long ago, we've had some here in the United States prior to this conflict. These are basically the Iranian security services going online, identifying people who are already involved in criminal behavior or good Iranians in the diaspora, and then threatening their families back home and trying to induce them to undertake nasty activities. So law enforcement, at least in North America and in Europe, for those companies with exposure there, law enforcement and intelligence services are pretty well versed in this Iranian methodology. Again, being outside the government, I can't speak any longer to the capabilities of the Israelis or North Americans or Europeans in the sort of counter cyber or collecting signals intelligence. But I would imagine preparations prior to the start of this conflict, the sort of cyber world is probably hyper vigilant right now and trying to identify where the Iranians might be targeting some of their diaspora or in contact with some of their proxy cells who are at one point in time were sent out abroad to basically wait for this type of day to undertake activities. But the protesters themselves, if they're Iranians stirred up, I think host nation governments are on top of it. The Gulf, my only last point, in the Shia population around the world, there are about 250 million Shia around the world. Iran is the largest Shia country. Pakistan is the second. India is the third. So Shia are all around, and there's a contingent of Shia in the Persian Gulf, particularly in Bahrain, in the oil eastern province of Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait. So Iran has some sort of built-in sort of sympathies among some of these populations. Lebanese Hezbollah, obviously being a big one, the Houthis in Yemen, another one. So they will try and stir the sentiments of these people. This is a war, and there's going to be some genuine outcry about innocents being killed. But the Iranians will also probably try and exploit it, whether it's for PR or for even more nefarious purposes.
Thank you. And Mark, I'd love to end. I know we're a little bit over time, so thank you all for staying on a little bit extra time. Mark, I'd love to end with you with your corporate expertise here. And based on everything you're seeing, are organizations overestimating or underestimating the risk right now?
In general, I would say underestimating, not because there isn't an appreciation for the severity of what's unfolding. I think that's clear to anybody following the news. But my sense is that since we've gotten into this, there has been an expectation that this is going to be time limited. To borrow Alina's use of the term from the State Department advisories, but more from a sense of and I think this is partially because of the messaging that came out of the White House and here in Washington in the early days. We're going to do this. It's going to be 3 weeks or 4 weeks of aerial bombardment, essentially, and then we're gonna go home, and either the Iranian regime will have fallen by that point, or Iran will be just so weakened and degraded that they can't pose a material risk to our allies and partners in the region or to the United States. I think what has become apparent in the weeks since day one is that, like every Middle East war, this one doesn't go exactly according to script and expectation. Even if in some cases those scripts and expectations were already long built in, like expectation that the Iranians might muck around in the Strait of Hormuz. So I think what we're seeing is just, to your question of overestimating or underestimating the risk, I think we may need to revisit some of the assumptions across corporate America about how long this may persist and the way in which it may persist. in the event that we do, like, let's say that we reach some sort of ceasefire, hostilities in this kind of formal or overt sense end within the next few weeks, even then, it's not like we return to status quo as it existed in February. We're in a fundamentally different place. The Iranians have been known for asymmetric activity essentially since 1979, the founding of the regime. And so I think we should just expect that we're in a different environment now in the Middle East and globally in terms of what this conflict looks like between the United States and Iran. And companies should be revisiting their assumptions about the region in particular, but also how that could impact them elsewhere in the world. And I don't think that's going to change, fundamentally in the next couple of weeks. I think it's going to extend for some time.
Let me just jump in as someone who's been in the region now for a long time with all sorts of different conflicts. And I just want to say too, it is not a region for the faint of heart, either diplomats or companies. But if you look at the span, and I don't disagree with what Mark said at all. It's just if you look at the 30, 40, almost 50 years of this region that has an enormous amount of resources and has really pushed forward on their own development. And in many cases, the Gulfies who are looking at diversifying their economy, that region will continue to have huge opportunities for American investment. The question is, how do we go forward? How do they and we go forward operating in a region of high volatility, unpredictability, but again, a great opportunity with shared objectives. The reality is the United States has never been kicked out of that region, no matter how bad the conflict, no matter how it was initiated, no matter how it ended. And the region is, I think, and I again remain an optimist, in the region. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spent over 40 years in the region. But you have to do it smartly, and you can't ignore the risks, and you can't be shocked when you wake up one morning and you know that some part of the region is in conflict. And that's why I think to both Ted and Mark's point, you need to be well informed because there are amazing opportunities, and we've seen that, I would say, in the last 10 years in the Gulf. And I think with this, the conflict is over. Everybody is going to be reorienting and learned from this experience yet again and be doubling down in the areas where they needed to make sure they had improvements, whether it's cyber, whether it's military, and including cooperation with countries in the region that they normally wouldn't have. So I leave it with that kind of a more upbeat region, and but it does take it takes a strong constitution to be in there.
Absolutely. I'd love to open to the floor here, and whoever wants to add just a brief note to this. It just came in through the registrar. So, what lessons has the U.S. learned from past efforts to shape political outcomes in the Middle East, as well as how did those lessons apply to the current situation with Iran?
Well, let me just quickly tick them off and let my other colleagues jump in. First of all, regime change and nation building is hard. And we've done some parts of that well, and we've done terribly at some parts of it. And we need to recognize that the reality of rebuilding a country is the responsibility of the people of that country. But how do you create the environment that they can do that? That's what we've been doing. We've been trying to do for a long, long time. But I think you also need to make it very clear what realistic and achievable objectives you're trying to achieve as we engage here. And we've changed that over many, many decades of engagement. But we have to continue to what is in it for the United States to be in a region that is, again, volatile, highly volatile, and unpredictable. And finally, I think you got to build coalitions to engage with them. It's not just military coalitions, it's also commercial and business coalitions if we're going to be successful. And I think that's what many of us have learned. And we still have a role in supporting the diversification and the development of that region. You know, whether it's Yemen, Syria, UAE, Saudi Arabia, we can be key partners. And where this conflict is going to leave Israel in the region, I think you're going to see countries that normally wouldn't have turned to Israel and engaged with them. I think that's going to change, and the acceptance of Israel as a major force of both security and economic activity is going to be important.
I'll maybe add one thing with a little bit of a contrarian twist, and that is alliances, not just coalition, alliances matter. And you saw, frankly, our inability for a lot of reasons to assemble a meaningful, powerful alliance to open up the Hormuz. And this isn't any criticism of anybody, but we, the United States, don't have the demining capability any longer that's required to get that done fast. And that's exactly what the Iranians preyed on by globalizing this crisis. So alliances matter. Alliances matter in this particular conflict because this is a joint war for the first time ever between the United States of America and Israel. Good, bad, indifferent, but those are the two key players. And any alliance is going to require leadership and stewardship to manage it and ensure that the military and political objectives of the conflict are in sync. But I think we can safely say there are probably differences of opinion on how one views Iran, whether you're sitting in Jerusalem or whether you're sitting in Washington, D.C. And, you know, today's big news, just to bring it all the way up to today, was President Trump has delayed hitting electrical infrastructure of Iran for 5 days. Well, watch what happened last night. Israel was striking electrical infrastructure of Iran throughout the evening. So somewhere there is not 100% uniformity on the goals and intentions of the two key players of this particular alliance during this particular conflict.
I'll just add one piece, Matt, when it comes to lessons learned in Middle East wars. You know, one thing that has been clear from the beginning of this conflict, and we don't know where it's going to go, but it has been clear that there's a strong reluctance, particularly on the part of the president, but others more generally, but particularly on the part of the president, to not commit boots on the ground in this conflict. Now that could change, and numerous administration officials have said repeatedly, we're leaving all options on the table. But it's important to just rewind the tape and recognize how many echoes of the Iraq War we see on a day-to-day basis as this conflict unfolds. And the reason I think that's particularly important to your listeners in corporate audiences is that when we committed troops in Iraq, it provided a target-rich environment for the Iraqi insurgency on the ground. And it therefore resembled other conflicts in this region where the nature of asymmetric attacks from insurgents against counterinsurgent forces, the goal there has been to bleed the invading army, right? We saw that same deal in Afghanistan when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. By not committing troops on the ground, we're depriving the adversary of those targets. And so I think we're already seeing a shift in what type of asymmetric targets are being selected, and that's towards economic targets, whether that's targeting energy infrastructure in the Gulf via kinetic attacks or shutting down Strait of Hormuz, because the Iranians can't exert pressure on the United States by killing American service members in large numbers right now. But they can exert pressure by shutting down the strait and making the globe feel the impact in the oil markets. And so I think that's a flag for companies to be aware of, that their risk profile and their exposure as targets may be indirectly correlated with how deeply the United States gets involved in this war. Right now, it's pretty easy for Iranians to hit companies relative to inflicting military damage on the United States, and clearly they're making good use of that.
Yeah. Thank you. This was all extremely insightful. And I'd like to thank all three of you again for joining. Alina, Ted, Mark, we appreciate it so much. And to the audience, that if you're still online, I know we went a little bit over time, but this discussion was extremely impactful for myself, and I'm sure the rest of our clientele.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.